All right, welcome, 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 welcome. Happy Sunday. As always, we are so very hopeful that everyone is maintaining your best physical, mental, and spiritual health during these extremely interesting times that we're faced with on all levels. Welcome here on Sunday to this 1 hour seminar sponsored by the All African People's Revolutionary Party, the logo you see on the lower left. Welcome to all who are joining us on Facebook as well as Zoom. We have been averaging about 500 people every week that we do this, and I think this is like our 12th or 13th week. So we welcome you, and just housekeeping notes, we will be, everyone on Zoom will be on mute. We will, but if you have questions or comments, you are certainly welcome to put them in the chat. If you don't know how to access that, you just move your cursor to the bottom of your screen and you'll see the chat function, and you can do that. And on Facebook, of course, you can write comments, and we are happy to talk about what you have to say about our topic for today. As always, we give much respect and thanks to the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, and that's from Alaska all the way down to the bottom tip of South America, Chile. This is all indigenous people's land. Do not go to protest chanting whose streets, our streets. These are not your streets. The streets, the sewers, the lakes, the rivers, the oceans, the mountains, all of this belongs to the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, and we can never forget that. And they certainly must get their land back, meaning this land that we're on right here is their land, and they must get it back. And we are only interested in helping them achieve that objective. So we give thanks to them for allowing us to have a 500+ year sojourn here in the Western Hemisphere, and we always acknowledge their struggle for justice. The fact that you have crooks, thieves, criminals, pathological liars going to the Paha Sapa, who some of you probably call Mount Rushmore, and talking about patriotism on indigenous people's land. I mean, that just gives the scene to people all over the world about how utterly insane people in this society are. So we acknowledge them. And we, of course, also acknowledge our African ancestors who fought from eastern shores of Africa, Somalia, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Kenya, so on and so forth, all the way across the African continent, across the Atlantic Ocean, all the way across the Western Hemisphere, the Caribbean, up to this part of North America, Central America, South America, fought. Slavery is over because our people fought, not because of the generosity or the altruism of European politicians and corporations. That had nothing to do with us being freed from slavery. We're free because we refuse to bow down. So we always thank and give respect to our African ancestors. And we welcome you here today. This is a very important topic. I'm sure most of you are here because you have engaged in conversation around this mythical concept of black on black crime. And this is a talking point that has been created by the white right in this society. And like most everything else, has been mimicked and parroted by a lot of some well-intentioned, some just utterly confused colonized people who operate under this assumption that African people are much more likely to kill each other than other ethnic groups. And the underlining element of that is that there must be something amiss with us, like we must have some frailty that allows us to have this dysfunction towards one another. And of course, if you accept any level of that mythical analysis, then the concept of us having the audacity to stand up against capitalist state power and protest state sanctioned murder by officers and agents of the state against our people, of course, it would have no credibility for people who believe in this quote unquote black on black crime myth. And so that's why we want to talk about it today. We want to break it down in its lowest common denominator and to give you some, hopefully some ammunition to fight back when you hear this backward analysis. So we're happy to have you here to do that for this next hour, and we'll just jump into it. Of course, as always, we like to always start, especially for those who are new, with introductions as to who we are. Again, stated that this is being sponsored by the All African People's Revolutionary Party, as it is every week. And myself, I'm a longtime member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Ajamu is my name, and I've organized for the party all over the world. And hopefully, as long as I have breath, we'll continue to do so. And before we talk a little bit about what the party is, just want to acknowledge that I'm joined today by my outstanding and wonderful and amazing daughter, Shakura, who has grown up in the Young Pioneer Institute of the All African People's Revolutionary Party and is now studying for her PhD in communication public health and is an outstanding activist in her own right and organizer in the area she lives. I've had the honor and privilege of participating in much of her activism work and just could not be prouder as a father and a comrade of my daughter who will be joining me here. And then also, just to understand when we say we are the All African People's Revolutionary Party, what we are is an international, independent, revolutionary, pan-African political party. And by pan, we mean all. And so when we say that, what we're saying is we believe that everybody of African descent all over the world is African and belongs to the African nation. And until Africa is free, unified, and socialist, which is our definition for Pan-Africanism, no African anywhere on earth will be free. So the core of our work is detailed in the book you see there on the screen, the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, written by the founder of the APRP, Kwame Nkrumah. And in that book, Nkrumah talks about the core of the Black Revolution is in Africa. And the key to achieving Pan-Africanism is to unite all African revolutionary formations on the ground throughout the African continent who agree that the solution to all of our problems, wherever we live on earth, is one unified socialist Africa. We realize that's a lot for a lot of you to grasp because, you know, what you know about African politics you got from CNN and CIA network, but the reality in real life on the ground outside of what they're lying to you about is that we do have formations on the ground all over the African continent, and you see the logos of some of those organizations who are fighting for one unified socialist Africa. Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. Azania is what African people call what you call South Africa. The African Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau, PAIGC, the Democratic Party of Guinea. Guinea and Guinea-Bissau are two separate countries in Africa. The Azanian People's Organization of Azania, again, which you would call South Africa. The Amilcar Cabral Ideological School in Nigeria. Zimbabwe Movement of Pan-African Socialists, obviously in Zimbabwe. All of these organizations are fighting for one unified socialist Africa and so are in unity and cohesion with the AAPRP structure. So we consider all of ourselves one, and we are fighting for this all over the world. We have chapters all throughout Africa, obviously, throughout Europe, Canada, all throughout the United Snakes of America, the Caribbean, and we are growing and building more and more and more every day to create this worldwide fighting force for Pan-Africanism. And we don't operate in a vacuum. We know that we are not the only people oppressed by capitalism and international imperialism. So we have strong relationships with other genuine revolutionary and progressive liberation movements, the Palestinian National Liberation Movement for a Palestinian national homeland and the destruction of the vicious Zionist system, the Irish Republican Socialist Movement to bring socialism to Ireland and to end hundreds, almost 1,000 years of British occupation of Ireland, the Filipino National Liberation Movement to bring about justice for the Filipino people, and of course, as I mentioned, the struggles of the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. So with that introduction, we'll go ahead and get started with the topic, the myth of myth and lie of black on black crime. And I'll hand it over to Shakura to get us started.
Okay, thank you so much, Daddy. And of course, with every weekend that we do this, I am more and more humbled and just grateful to have the opportunity to learn and to talk with all of you and to just kind of have a dialogue about this. This is definitely embedded in the work that I do. And it's always great to see new names as well as the ones that are with us every weekend. So I thank you all for joining us today. All right, so as you take a look at the bullets I have on the slide, I want to draw your attention to this idea that for the most part, everything that you understand about African on African crime is a capitalistic myth, okay? So this capitalistic myth of white supremacy relies on the narrative that African people are primitive and violent people. Once a person accepts this racist foundation, then it becomes easy to convince them that police terror against African people is a minor issue compared to the constant killing of Africans against other Africans. So another way to say that is I like to draw your attention to just think back to your childhood for a moment, especially if you grew up in the United States. So if you grew up here, I want you to think about how we were socialized when we went to school and how we were taught to think about the service that police offer. Like, what is their role in our communities, right? So if you're thinking about maybe 2 or 3 adjectives to describe them, I guarantee you one of your adjectives now it might be, but back then when you were 6 and 7, 8 years old, it probably was something like safety, or it might have been something like called problem solving or something like that. But what's interesting to me is this play on words that we're socialized as a society to think about African people as primitive and violent, but we're not socialized to think about police in the same way. When clearly the data doesn't lie and we can see from numerous brutal attacks, right? Like that's literally where the term police brutality came from. So I just find that ironic that that's not what we're teaching our children, even though like that's literally what's happening. And like I said, the evidence is right there. So just wanted to bring your attention to that as we continue on. I want to also make sure you understand that, so because of that, this capitalistic narrative is that the right-wing propaganda constantly promotes this narrative of enhancing the issue of Africans killing Africans over Africans being killed outside of their community to discredit any discussion about police and state terror that is against African people. This concept that African people somehow are more prone to violence has no historical, analytical, or data-driven basis in truth. It's all an illusion designed to convince people already cozying up to that same racist ideology that I mentioned above and many more that exist out there, that their beliefs are justified. So it's basically a play on play and a build, if you will. I want to give you some type of information and then I want to build on top of that and really create this idea that you should be fearful. You should fear African men when you see them walking on the street. And you should definitely not go to that part of Memphis because who knows what will happen if you go there, right? Like all these things that are playing into that, literally. Daddy, I don't know if you remember, I know you do, but the first time he came to visit me in Memphis, he met this random guy at the airport and the man told him, he had never met my dad before, but he told him not to let me date any men that are from Memphis. And so clearly my dad and I practice anti-patriarchal motives all the time. So the first thing was my dad's not gonna tell me who to date, right? That's the first thing. But the second thing is like, I think it speaks volumes that this person is from this community and is literally telling a stranger that he knows is visiting the city to outlaw and outban any man here. And I think that speaks volume in terms of how he sees himself, how he sees the people here, and also perpetuating that same white supremacy ideology that I just mentioned to you. I just really think that's interesting. And that's a true story. And I'm sure it happens all the time, everywhere, but for case in point, I'm talking about the city that I live in. So I thought that was interesting. And so going back to that illusion, I just want to make sure that you all understand that that narrative that I just mentioned is also a part of the systemic efforts of white supremacy to dehumanize African people, as well as indigenous people, our brothers and sisters whose land this is. Because once a person is dehumanized or their community that they assimilate and come from, then it becomes much easier to not care about what happens to them. Okay, so again, like it's this building progression as it goes, right? Next slide, please. Okay, so anyone who wants to know the truth in the area can find that with just a simple mouse click. All you have to do is go to Brother Google, as I call it. The reality is, despite the fact that interracial social interaction has increased over what is almost decades ago now, most people still function almost exclusively within their own ethnic groups. That means that people most likely live, date, marry, socialize, and kill people who also look like them. So my dad mentioned earlier that this whole notion about Africans are, 100 times more likely or 90 times more likely to kill in their communities than other communities. You can see from the bullets that the data is really not that far off. So this whole notion of 4 times and 90 times, like, that's all a lie. That is all a lie. And just to add case in point, this also means that the 6-point difference between all ethnic groups in social science jargon is negligible, meaning the difference isn't large enough, especially considering social conditions, economic or income access, and education all contribute to a notable difference. And I think that's really important for us to think about, especially as we think about our communities that we grew up in, how our parents raised us, what access to things our parents did or did not have, how all of that contributes to us being who we are, especially our own cultural norms that we embedded in our household, or maybe we picked up along the way, how we moved from place to place and picked up other norms from other cities so that we could survive and figure out how to live. An example of that would be, I was not raised to use sir or ma'am, but I use those ideologies here in Memphis because in the South, that's a culture that people understand, and you get different service when you quote unquote respect people by talking to them that way. So, this idea of how do we survive as we relocate around the world, well, you have to accept and adopt new ideologies, because otherwise you're going to stick out like a sore thumb and you're not going to make it, because you have to figure out how to survive, right? So thank you so much for your time today.
All right, so thank you, Shakura, as always, wonderful. So let's break down further. Shakura has done an outstanding job of giving you the foundation as to where this backward notion of this myth of quote unquote black on black crime came from. And then she also just gave you irrefutable data and this is the data that's coming from the United States government. So, if anybody from the US government tells me the sky is blue, I have a hard time believing it. So you can assume that if that's what they're saying, it's probably even more so closer to the truth to look beyond that. They're going to give you the most biased version of anything, because that's what they do. So looking at that data, clearly, like Shakura said, a 6% difference among all ethnic groups is not even anything in social science circles. That's not even enough to be considered a realistic difference. And especially if you factor in the socioeconomic conditions, then there really is no difference. But beyond that, let's look at the absurdity of the argument itself, right? And talk about why it just doesn't make any sense. So there are 2.2 million people who are incarcerated in the US today. That's by far the largest number in the world. That's the largest number and the largest percentage in the world today. Of those 2.2 million people, 40% of those people incarcerated in this country are Africans. So that's almost 1 million of the 2.2 million people are African people in this country. Meanwhile, we make up only 13% of the US population in this country. So we're 13% of the population, and we're 40% of those incarcerated. So what does that tell you? Well, it tells you either one of two things. Either we are just the most criminal people in human history, or something adverse is happening to us. And if you believe the latter, or if you know somebody that believes the latter, and I guarantee you do, the unfortunate thing for them is they have absolutely no evidence to support the position that we are the most criminal people on earth. Even though they might say it and believe it all the time, they don't have any evidence to support that. Whereas there is substantial evidence to support the notion that there is something happening to us. And that something is the capitalist system, this dominant economic system we live under, where profit is more important than people, where all of the means of production is owned and controlled by private profit for private corporations, rather, for profit. It's that system that was built. The whole industrialization process, the development of products, as we talk about every week, was built from the seed money provided by the transatlantic slave trade, which kidnapped and brought our people to the Western Hemisphere. And that entire system is continually financed and maintained through the continued exploitation of African rare earth minerals and resources. We cannot even be talking through these devices we're talking to without the exploitation of African rare earth minerals. So this process, in order to justify this exploitation, which is the reason why Africa is so poor and why African people, wherever we live on earth, 120 countries on all the continents, we're the poorest people. This system, in order to justify that reality, because you can only do two things. You can say, well, this is happening because these people were exploited, devastatingly exploited, or you can say, well, this is happening because there's something wrong with these people. They're just inhumane, they're primitive, they're incapable of functioning. So what white supremacy is the myth that was designed to justify this system and to take the latter approach that I just spoke of. So yeah, you're only 13% of the population, but you're 40% of the people incarcerated because you people are just foul. You're just evil. All you know how to do is destroy stuff. And that's why we have to put you in prison. So that's the general basis there. And it feeds into what Shakur talked about why it's so easy for people to believe that we would have the propensity to kill each other more than anyone else when there's absolutely no evidence to support that, including many of us. Many Africans believe that. And so, we all know too that the reason why we're in prison is because of the sentencing disparities, and the whole basis of white supremacy is to keep us under lock and key, because this system, since it's built on exploiting us and our homeland, Africa, it has to keep us oppressed so that we can never unite and realize the problem is this system. The problem is not the statues. The statues are just manifestations of the system. The problem is not just police. Police are just manifestations of the system. The problem is the system itself. The system, the statues aren't the only thing that has to go. The system has to go. And so since we know that, the role of this system is to do everything in its power to prevent us from realizing that and coming to that process of organization to challenge this system. So they got to do everything to us, shoot us down in the streets, disrespect us, put us in prison, all of that to keep us off balance so that we can't get our act together and organize this worldwide fighting force to crush the system. So yes, of course, there's sentencing disparities. The African who's convicted of the same thing or even less is going to be much more likely to be 6 times more likely to be convicted and in prison. I mean, there's volumes of data written about that. We don't need to spend another second talking about that. You got Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, and so much else to validate that with data and clear information to substantiate that. So if you don't know that, or people don't know that, that's just because they don't want to know it. And they just want to continue to say what they're saying because it makes them feel better about their miserable lives. I don't know. But if you really wanted to know something and you were talking about something, you would study it. I was on being challenged by this European man a few days ago, and he was talking about protests. He made a comment on an article I wrote talking about protests are worthless, blah, 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 blah. So I said, well, what protests, how many protests have you attended, and or what have you studied about protests? Because I've organized countless protests and attended countless more. So I just want to know what your basis of analysis is. And he said, well, I don't need to go to a protest, blah, 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 blah. And I said, well, I'm not asking you to go. I don't care what you do. I'll be honest with you. I don't care if you drop in the street right now. I'm asking you that question because if you don't have any experience and the way you answered, clearly that means you don't, then why would you think anybody would care about your opinion about it? Nobody cares. And I don't think it's humanly possible for me to care less what you think about anything. You don't even, it's like me standing there telling people who identify as women and have had babies, me standing there lecturing them, challenging them about the process of childbirth, absolutely worthless. So these things are here. You know, there's clearly a system. We're arrested, we're put in prison, these things happen. It's a part of this system. And if you want to understand just the systemic elements of this thing, if you look at Canada, for example, and you know, Canada's a white settler colony like the US, so I'm not trying to say they're different, but my point is that the way that they systematize white supremacy is very similar. So in Canada, Indigenous people are 40% of the population, or 40% of the incarcerated population up there. There are 40 million people in Canada, 40,000 of them are incarcerated, and Indigenous people represent 40% of the incarcerated population in Canada, when they're not even 5% of the population in Canada. So if you study that deeper, you will see the same types of disparities that exist in this backward system here. So let's talk about, because I think it's pretty clear, let's just say it, there's no such thing as quote unquote black on black crime. That doesn't exist. But if you want to look at crime among Africans, we certainly are more than prepared to talk about that. And so we want to spend the next couple of minutes talking about, when there is violence among our people, where does that violence stem from? Why does it happen? All right, because when the Green Bay Packers win a Super Bowl, the white people in Wisconsin are gonna riot and tear up everything over a silly football game. So nobody ever talks about that. You know, at least if we engage in tearing up a city, there's always a clear and legitimate reason for it. It's because we're tired of being brutalized. Whereas other people tear up a city because their baseball team won a championship game. So let's talk about, when we do engage in violence, why African people are doing that. Let's talk about the reasons for that. So a lot of you have seen this movie, Hotel Rwanda, that talked about the carnage in Rwanda in 1994. And I love Don Cheadle. He's a great actor. I love his acting, but the movie was absolutely worthless, like any Hollywood movie. And too many people rely on Hollywood movies to form the basis of what they understand about history. And that's the problem, because that and any other movie you can think of are not telling you anything about what actually happened in a given historical circumstance. So let's talk about what happened in Rwanda in 1994, when almost 300,000 people were killed in that country. So the makeup in Rwanda is that the Hutu ethnic group makes up 90% of the population in Rwanda. The Tutsi ethnic group makes up 9% of the population in Rwanda. The Twa are 1%, or what racists call pygmies. There's no such thing as pygmies. They're the Twa people. So that's 100%. That's all of the people that live in Rwanda. So clearly the Hutus are the clear and unquestionable majority in Rwanda. So from thousands of years, we have no documented evidence of the Hutus and the Tutsis having any serious conflict getting along. Like any ethnic groups who live side by side with each other, there's historically intermarriage, existence, all of those things. So it's absurd to suggest that, well, the Hutus and the Tutsis have never been able to get along. That's just not true. And anybody who tries to say that about what happened in Rwanda just simply doesn't know what they're talking about. So the Hutus are the clear majority. And for a number of years, although they were a majority there, like I said, it wasn't really an issue of conflict. What happened in the 1950s is that the French, wanting to gain strategic advantage in Rwanda, began to train and arm Hutus to dominate over Tutsis in an effort to ensure that the French could have their colonial influence developed in that region. Because by what they wanted to accomplish is ensuring that the Hutus were there to serve their interests. So they provided them with incentives and, the things that are done in colonialism to become loyal to the interests of the French. Now, what happened is the folks from Belgium, wanting to undermine French influence in Rwanda, began to do the same thing for the Tutsis. And with the help of other colonizing forces, at some point in the 1960s, the Tutsis, although being only 9% of the population, began to gain control and establish a system of domination over the Hutu people. And by system of domination, what we mean is that once that system is established, if you were Hutu, you had to constantly carry identification, legitimizing your presence. You were no longer allowed to attend school in most instances, and you certainly were not permitted to own cattle, which in most parts of Africa, owning cattle is the social equivalent of owning property here in the United States. It's the symbol of upward mobility and status and stability. And so this system reigned of oppression of Tutsis serving the interests of Belgium over Hutus who had been serving the interests of France until 1994, when, backed by France, the Hutus rose up and committed systemic murder against Tutsi people in many instances. And because they had a 9-to-1 advantage, they were able to do that. And this is the fundamental reason why over almost 300,000 people were killed in Rwanda. But the Hotel Rwanda movie told you nothing about what I just explained to you. It just made it seem as if there's just something wrong with these African people, these Black people, quote unquote, and that all they can do is just terrorize each other and take each other's life and be destructive. No, it's the hand of colonialism that caused the conflict in Rwanda. It's the hand of colonialism that caused the conflict in Sudan. It's the hand of colonialism and neo-colonialism that has caused the conflicts in East Africa. And if you have time, we're happy to demonstrate to you why we make that claim. But we'll just, for this time, use Rwanda as a simple example. And then we'll bring it, as we said, this is what happened in Rwanda for that 94 conflict. And then let's talk about some of the violence that happens in the US, or what they call gang violence, because that's the element that's consistently, identified to justify this Black, quote unquote, Black on Black crime myth. And it's that, these gangs kill each other and they're so violent towards each other. And it's just, something that we have to understand about the frailties of us as a people. So let's look at Los Angeles. What is the history of Los Angeles? If you look at neighborhoods, like when African people came out here, and like every ethnic group, people evolve and move to various areas geographically. They make geographical movements based on political and economic conditions. In the United States of America, there's no better example of that than the history of African people and our movements in the society. In other words, when we move, it's because we're trying to find better economic conditions. And so the reason why African people exist on the West Coast in the United States is because we came here seeking a better economic way of life from the southern states. The overwhelming majority of Africans here, because of slavery, were in the southern states. And we came out here looking for better life, to get out of the Jim Crow reality that existed in the South. And this is such a phenomenon that there are books written about it, about the mass migration of African people to the big northern cities, New York, Detroit, Chicago, et cetera, and to out west here, where I am here in California. And there are even songs that that are talking about what I'm describing to you, even though you may not even stop to think that that's what they're talking about in these songs. If you listen to Otis Redding singing "Sitting by the Dock of the Bay," this is what he's singing about, you all. He says, "I left my home in Georgia, headed for the Frisco Bay." That's what he's talking about. And Gladys Knight and the Pips, when they're singing "Midnight Train to Georgia," that's what that song is about. And there are so many other ones like that. So this is my family's history. My family was kidnapped and taken to Louisiana, and their African names were stripped, and they were given a French name that I wore as a youth until I changed it. And then they moved in the 50s, both of my parents, not knowing each other, moved to San Francisco. And so that's our story. So we did that in Los Angeles. There were factory jobs in Los Angeles, and our people moved from Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, etc., to come out to Los Angeles in the 50s to get those jobs, because those companies were hiring African people, and they were decent paying jobs with some of the other benefits. And that was a big opportunity for us. So we took it, we uprooted, and we took it, and we moved out here in mass to Los Angeles. But Los Angeles was just as racist as Louisiana, Texas, and all the places we left. So they had redlining, so we can only live in certain areas. So when redlining permitted us to move to areas like Compton, LA, Compton, California, for example, which was previously a white suburb in Los Angeles, up through the mid 50s, that's what it was. And then we began to move there because that was one of the only places we could live. And because there were white people there who had been there, they began to terrorize our people moving into Compton. And so you had white gangs. The largest one was called the Spook Hunters, and they used to terrorize African people. And so to protect ourselves, we developed our own street organizations, the Businessmen, the Gladiators, the many groups like that. I can't remember the one right now that Munchie Carter, the Black Panther, was a part. I'll remember in a second. The Slossons. And we began to organize groups like that to protect ourselves against the white terrorists, the Spook Hunters. And then as white people began to leave, white flight happened, and Compton became an overwhelmingly African city. Then the factories closed in the 60s, they moved out, the jobs were eliminated, and more people were living there. So you had spaces that were really supposed to be designed for 5 people. Now you had 20 people in them. The economic conditions were dire. This created extreme tension in the neighborhoods. So these organizations began to turn on each other. And this is something that would happen to any people, not just African people, under those same social conditions. And then on top of that, when you add the system perpetuating gang violence, because you have these joint task force against gang violence. If there's no gang problem, there's no reason for those task force to exist. So a lot of them begin to figure out ways to perpetuate the problem so that they can maintain their budgets and their departments and their systems. And there's overwhelming evidence to substantiate this, overwhelming evidence. And that's why anyone familiar with street violence in inner cities knows that the police always perpetuate gang violence, always perpetuate gang violence. When there's a peace treaty, the police always set up drive-by shootings to destroy the peace treaty. There's plenty of evidence of that. You can read volumes of books talking about this. You can read books that talk about how in the Congo, when the Central Intelligence Agency, or Criminals in Action as we call them, when they were trying to destabilize our people's legitimate thrust to gain independence in the Congo in the 1960s with the National Congolese Movement and Patrice Lumumba, and they assassinated him. CIA had him assassinated so that they could maintain that mineral wealth, those rare earth minerals I talked about. The Congo is the richest mineral region on the planet Earth, and they were not trying to let it go and let it be utilized for us. They wanted to keep it for the multinational capitalist corporations. So they had to destroy any movement to do that. And the fact that Che Guevara and the Cubans went over to help our people, they still were not able to be successful, and they were able to do that. But what we know for a fact is that the CIA flew many anti-Cuban revolution Cubans who just unfortunately happened to be Africans into the Congo so that they could pose as people in opposition to the legitimate national Congolese liberation movement. And the reason why we know that is that many of these people were captured, and when they were captured, they did not speak Lingala, which is the dominant language in the Congo. They did not even speak Swahili, which is a language widely spoken in that region. And most of them only spoke Spanish. So how are you only speaking Spanish in the Congo? And further interrogations, well, I'm not even Congolese, I'm actually Cuban, and I was sent here to do this, so it would make it look like there's mass uprisings against the National Congolese Liberation Movement. Well, that same tactic is utilized in United Snake Cities, you all. The same thing happens in United Snake Cities. That's what happens. So a lot of this so-called conflict among African people is manufactured by the capitalist system. That's a fact. And even when it is us fighting against each other, the basic political and economic conditions we live under are more than enough reason to explain why that happens. And we talked about the spook hunters there. And then also, you know, if you look at LA, because the same conditions I described in LA, the same thing is the case in Chicago. The same, and there's certain things that happen when I read stuff about Chicago that I know it's the police doing it. Because there are a lot of things, the way they happen, it's not even how our street organizations move, not even culturally how we do things. You know, like some of the things in Chicago, if you study it, like the letters they say are sent from one group or another, not even using a style of communication that African people use. Clearly somebody European wrote it. And, you know, it's our fault that we're so gullible that we buy into it. But my point is that it's a systemic thing designed to keep us fighting one another. And so if you look at after the LA Rebellion in 1992, and these are things you can research. Like Shakur said, you can find this out in just a matter of a moment. There is absolutely no reason for people to be confused about these facts that we're laying out here. So after the LA Rebellion in 92, the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, no longer needing agents working on so-called espionage by the former Soviet bloc or former Eastern Bloc countries because of the fall of the Eastern Bloc, sent 300 of those agents who were previously working in that area into Los Angeles. So the question is, what were they sent into Los Angeles to do? Because you can't give me a report of what they're doing. And the reason why you can't is because it never has been officially reported, even though a number of times the demand has been made to understand what those agents were doing in Los Angeles. Well, I can tell you what they were doing in Los Angeles. They were there to engage in counterinsurgency methods, to ensure that our street organizations continue to fight each other. They have been doing that in LA since the 60s when they worked diligently to turn Maulana Karenga's US organization against the Black Panther Party in LA, and they continue to do that to this day. And when they can't do it with African on African organizations, they do it with African against indigenous, or what you call Latino organizations. Several years ago, there was a situation in LA, some of you may remember it, where people were shooting cars on freeways from freeway off-ramps and bridges. They were shooting at cars passing by on freeways. This was happening a lot. And they supposedly were trying to figure out who was doing that and how to stop it. And so what ended up happening is that a rumor surfaced that what was going on is that the Mexican mafia was either themselves or having their surrogate gangs shoot at cars that had African young men in them that had white t-shirts on, which was the generally suspected uniform of the Rolling 60s Crip set. And this was the rumor that was circulating in the streets, despite the fact that all kinds of people were being, because your car is speeding by, you can't see who's in the car. They were just randomly shooting at cars. But this was the rumor that was spread. And it was traced that this rumor originated from the LA County Sheriff's Department. And the purpose of this rumor, and there were several undercover sources in that department who leaked that that's where the rumor came from and provided evidence to organizations that that's where it came from. And the reason why they did that is because they want to keep the violence going between our communities. And I actually attended meetings during that time in Los Angeles with African organizations where Africans were talking about, we need to do something about these Mexicans attacking us. And a number of us had to clarify for those folks, like, you're being manipulated by white supremacy. and capitalism to believe that. Don't let anybody tell you who your enemies are. And so fortunately, those efforts worked, and there's been some level of violence, but the enemy has not been successful in overwhelmingly turning our communities against each other, although a lot of us perpetuate it either wittingly or unwittingly. It has not been successful. So this is the hype, and this is the process that perpetuates this violence against us. And then also I mentioned the struggle in the Congo and how that struggle was about perpetuating violence. And we explained that, what happened to make sure that those rare earth minerals were still available to capitalism, the uranium, the coltan or cobalt that runs these devices, the diamonds, the gold, all of the mineral, the zinc. Zinc is what is the metal that's used. Like if you look at cars like the, what's the one that's very popular now? I can't even think of the name of it right now, but you know which one I'm talking about, that doesn't run on gasoline, and it drives itself, whatever those damn cars are called. So, all of these things, the aerodynamic design that they have, you have to use zinc to create that. Zinc is the metal that bends the metal. You can't get zinc in plentiful supply anywhere except in that Congo region. So this crisis was manufactured. Patrice Lumumba was assassinated. His body was dissolved in acid, and utter chaos and terror was inflicted against the Congolese people for decades. So this happened in the early 60s. And do you know that basic infrastructures like schools, like healthcare, none of this existed on a consistent level in the Congo from the early 1960s until the late 2000s is before you began to see any of this type of infrastructure begin to operate on a consistent level throughout the entire country of the Congo. So that's like, you're talking about 50 years, 40 years of instability that existed, and you want to wonder why Africa's in the shape that it's in today. This is the fault of colonialism and neo-colonialism that this happens, nothing else. It has nothing to do with any deficiency on the part of our people, nothing at all to do with that, despite what movies you see. If you want to understand the deficiencies in the Congo, point to Criminals in Action, the CIA. That's the result. That's the reason why there's this instability in the Congo. And it's the same with Chicago, as we discussed. Systemic racism, overcrowding, these are the reasons why these conditions exist. Lack of economic opportunities, and all these inner cities are nothing but death traps. And anybody placed in that situation, you want to know how systemic that is. That's the saying, crabs in a barrel. They're crowded in a barrel and they're pulling each other in. But the barrel is not their natural habitat. And Chicago is not our natural habitat. And Africa is our natural habitat, but we don't control our natural habitat. So and we don't control it because the forces that do control it need to keep us unstable so that they can continue to control it. Because the solution to our problem is there. And what they don't want us to realize is that we don't have to beg them for a job here when we come from the place that produces all the minerals that controls the production of the products where we're trying to get a job. So that's the struggle that we have to figure out. And once we do that, we'll be unstoppable, but they're gonna do everything in their power to prevent us from understanding that. So if that means flooding weapons, drugs, whatever into our communities to distract us, to turn us against each other, that's what they're gonna do. But this concept that we do that any more than anyone else is absolutely insane. In fact, I saw a meme from a young European man that said it all. He said, I grew up in suburbs. We had drugs every day. We had guns everywhere, but nobody was systemically targeting us for policing. Otherwise, we would be in prison too. So it's not like these white suburbs, these kids aren't using drugs and don't have weapons. That's insane if you believe that, but nobody's targeting them. So they get away with it. Whereas everybody's watching us in the inner cities. And so of course you're gonna find something because the jobs are gone. Like I said, the factories have closed. So people are trying to find ways to hustle to earn a living. And I'm not justifying them selling drugs, but I'm saying if you're in a dire situation, people aren't always going to make good choices when they're in dire conditions. And you listening to this, when you've been in dire conditions, you didn't make good choices either. So stop acting like you did every single time. So that's just the reality of human life. So, you know, to resolve that, we have to create a system, which is socialism, where people have the opportunity to make better choices. And guess what? When people have that opportunity, they do make better choices. And there's unquestionable data to substantiate that. So no pressure on European communities so they don't have this kind of dilemma and they can't be targeted for this type of thing, okay? So this doesn't mean that like there's some problem and we just don't have the capacity to have unity. Please don't believe that. And so I just want to make sure you understand, if you don't, and I'm not trying to insult anybody, but unless you study this thing, you're not going to understand it because it's not something that's talked about. Our people do have unity. And I know this because I belong to an organization, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, that has people in it from a number of countries around the world: Africa, Europe, Canada, the United States, the Caribbean, all over the world. We have Africans in there. A lot of those Africans can't speak English. They might speak French, they might speak Portuguese, Creole, Wolof, Mandinka, Fante, Fulani, Ashanti. They may speak Spanish. They may speak any number of languages. And the King's English, Africanized English, or what they call Ebonics. The point is that we are living proof that African people are uniting. The picture you're looking at here, there are Africans in that picture from probably about 15 different countries around the world. But all of these Africans are united for one purpose: to achieve one unified socialist Africa. Because whether some of those people in there are from Kenya or Nigeria, some of those people in there are from the United States, some are from Canada, doesn't matter. All of us understood, and you can see me in the very back there in the center, all of us understood that until Africa is free, we're not going to be free. So this was just a meeting we had in Ghana about 1.5 years ago to further consolidate our efforts. So we do have the capacity and ability to unite, and it is happening, but you're never going to learn about that by just watching CIA and getting their perspective. And if you want to get another piece of evidence about, you know, how we do come together as a people on a worldwide basis, I encourage you to watch our African Liberation Day program from May 25th. The video is on the All African People's Revolutionary Party YouTube page, and you can see it. And if you just watch the video, you'll see presentations from multiple people from different countries around the world talking about our work to bring about one unified socialist Africa, talking about it in various languages, okay? So check that out. So there's no question we can achieve unity and that we're doing it. Don't listen to these bourgeois lies that tell us that we can't do it. That's all a part of this effort to keep us from realizing our potential. That's all that is. And so the last thing that I want to say is, as always, we want to invite you who are African to listen to this message. Until we are organized, we will never have freedom and justice. So many of our people last week, we were so excited to see the 300-400 Africans with guns marching to the Ku Klux Klan office in Stone Mountain, Georgia. Now, I understand, like, if you're not involved in our liberation struggle, that's going to be very exciting for you, you know, because it symbolizes us standing up. And I understand if you're not involved in the work, symbolism is all you got. But for those of us who participate in this work to liberate our people, symbolism stopped being enough for us a long time ago. I don't want to just march to the Klan office. I want to put the Klan out of business in forever. I want to put the police out of business forever. I want to put the imperialist US military out of business forever. And there's no way we can accomplish any of that without organization, you all. We cannot have 400 of us with guns and then the majority of our people not belonging to any organization working for our liberation and thinking that that's going to somehow solve our problem for us. This is not a diatribe against us arming ourselves. Please understand that we're revolutionaries and armed struggle is always a part of revolution, but revolution is organized. Revolutionary violence is organized. It's not 300 or 400 people, it's millions of people engaged in this process and organized for a single objective. So all of us have to be in organizations. There's no way around that. So we want to encourage you, if you're African, to join the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And if you want to do that, the way you can do it is you can contact our site here, aprp-intl.org, and you can just say, hey, I want more information about how I can join. Or if you want to contact me directly, you can do that at the second link there, abetterworld.me, and just say, hey, I'm interested in the APRP. I want to know more about it. How can I join? And you can do that. If you're not African, again, as we said in the beginning, we're for creating revolutionary organization everywhere. So we want to invite you to join an organization or start an organization if you can't join one. And if you need help knowing how to do that and ensuring that your organization has a political education process built into it, because ours does, and you need that. You know, you can't just read a book every once in a while and think you're being politically educated. No, the capitalist system propagandizes you 24/7, 365 days. So if you're not a part of a consistent ideological program and you think you understand what's going on, you're just fooling yourself. So you got to have that. So if you need help doing that, we'll help you do it. And all of these sites here, including the Hood Communist site there, are outstanding resources about what's going on in the African world from a revolutionary African perspective. So we encourage you to check out all three and get information from a revolutionary African perspective on a consistent basis. And so with that, I'll stop. I haven't been able to check anything. I don't know, Shakura, if you have seen anything at all.
Yeah, we have a couple of chats I want to highlight. Okay. So during my talk, we had some comrades from Los Angeles check in, and Bobby was able to help them out. They didn't know that you were Facebook Living on your page. So thank you again, Bobby, for that. And then after that, Glenn said it shows arrest rates when it was your turn to talk. It shows an arrest rates too. People get arrested, then get trapped in the bail system, et cetera, while many are detained but not convicted, especially under programs like Stop and Frisk and its mutations. And then Bobby was honest and said, oh no, I like Hotel Rwanda. I'm about to get schooled. I'm ready. They'll expose me to the And then Glenn said, I love those books. Lots of great work on how Africans are self-determined. Then I went on to just comment on what Bobby said, and he checked in. I'm sorry, Bobby checked in and said Tesla when you were trying to remember the car.
Tesla, thank you, Bobby.
For me,
yes.
it was profound. So I shared Spook Hunters because I had never heard of that group before, and using us to break up the Black Panther Party was strategic and intentional. And then, yeah, that's it.
All right, excellent. Well, I mean, I think the last thing, you know, we just want to highlight again is encourage people. You know, it's a broken record, but it's still something that still needs to be said. We got to get people in organizations. Your organization has to have a political education program. It has to have, and that political education program should be anti-capitalist. It should be pro something other than capitalism, whether it's socialism, that's what it is for us. Whether it's anarchism, it can't be capitalism. And it needs to be anti-patriarchal. That's a problem. We should be anti-patriarchal. Patriarchy is a system that's oppressive to anyone that identifies as a woman or a non-man, and it should be anti-homophobic. Homophobia has no place in any liberation movement. We're trying to unite every African for the African Revolution. We don't want any Africans left out, and we want to build a society that includes everybody. And I'm not at the least bit concerned about anything other than uniting humanity under justice. So your organization has to have those components. And if you don't have all of that going on a consistent basis right now, this is the reason why we can't move forward, you all. because everybody thinks that their individualistic approach is the right way to do it. And clearly that's not working. I mean, if you have a great individualistic solution, I wish you would implement it. Because if you could do that, then I could just go camping and enjoy myself and ride my bike. So you clearly don't have that. So we got to let the ego go. We got to get in organizations fighting for justice. And we'll just close it out on that. We'll come back next week with another topic. Appreciate everyone joining. Stay strong, you all. Stay healthy. Stay positive. Stay optimistic. Forward ever, backwards never. Always stay clever. As always, we stand ready for a revolution. Have a good rest of your day and take care of yourselves.